sourdough bread, what it is and how to get started. In a separate video, I'm going to go over the steps of how to create and bake the actual loaf. But in this video, I wanted to start from the very basics, the key part of a great sourdough loaf, and that is your starter. We'll be going over the materials you need, the kinds of starters out there, the beginning to the end process of how to create your own starter, how to maintain that starter, and how to convert a starter. First, what is sourdough? Sourdough is a bread that uses natural yeast as the leavening agent. While it does take longer, it's naturally fermented, and so it means that there's a lot of health benefits. It's easier for our bodies to digest because it's breaking down a lot of those proteins and the gluten first here in the jar before it goes into our bodies. So first, let's get started with what we need to create a starter from scratch. So first, I recommend a scale. You don't have to have a scale. Our forefathers did this long without fancy materials, and I totally believe you can be successful in your kitchen without them as well. There are a few simple tools though that I do believe really help in your kitchen, and one of those is a scale. You don't have to have it for your starter, or even your loaf, but it really will make your life easier, especially when it comes to forming the loaves. You can get an inexpensive one off of Amazon for less than $15. So definitely a good investment. I also love to use a silicone spatula. It really helps stir and scrape things down, but any kind of mixing device will work. I like to have some kind of marker for my starter jar. This can be a rubber band, it can be masking tape. It just helps you see how, when, and if your starter is growing. And then our most important materials and ingredients just are flour and water. How simple is that? You can use any kind of flour. I will make some suggestions. The only requirement is that it should be unbleached flour. Bleached flour contains chemicals that will prohibit your starter from rising properly. So I recommend just sticking with unbleached flour. I like to use a combination of rye flour and then unbleached bread flour. You can use straight all-purpose flour though, as long as it's unbleached. I've seen people do just straight rye flour. The reason why I like to add rye is because it really helps get your starter active really quickly. If you're not a huge rye fan, you don't have to do this, and you can also convert your starter later. But if you're looking to really get a strong, hearty, active starter, which can therefore produce a stronger, heartier bread, I definitely recommend adding a little bit of this to your starter. But again, don't have to. And then when it comes down to your water, it just needs to be water that doesn't have chlorine in it. Some of our tap water has chlorine in it, some of it doesn't. My personal tap water does contain a small amount of chlorine. I learned that the hard way. I was wondering why my starter wasn't working, and as soon as I switched to filtered water, it's problem solved. So make sure you're using some kind of filtered water, or make sure your tap water doesn't have chlorine in it. That's often posted online if you Google your city's water. I have here a few kinds of starters that we could talk about. I have one with just straight all-purpose flour. I have one with my half and half of bread flour and rye flour, and then I have a starter that's just straight kamut all-purpose flour, which I like. So it's nice to have a few different starters depending on what you want to make with it, but you really only need one starter in your home. To create your own starter that we're going to start today is about a 7-day and up to a 14-day process. So it can take a while. It's fun to do, it's easy to do, but you don't have to do that in order to obtain a starter. A starter is super easy to share. So if you have a friend that has a starter, all you need is a small spoonful from them. You can also buy starters online. So let's get started. I also should have mentioned you need some kind of container, of course. So you can use a glass container, or I've seen people use plastic deli containers, which work really well. Just some kind of container that's large enough for your starter. You see I have a couple of different sizes here. I like these smaller mason jars. This is a perfect size for the kind of starter that I carry. But I also like these larger ones because it's large enough for my leaven that we'll talk about later, just like the growth of the starter when it comes to making the bread. So use what you have or choose what you're comfortable with, but I keep a relatively smaller starter just to decrease the amount of waste of flour. And then when it comes to baking the bread, then I bulk it up and make more. So, but all you really need is this, or even if you're gonna have a super small starter, even a little less than this. You just need enough for your starter to at least double in size. So you'll see as we get going here. So all you need to start is equal parts of flour and water in weight. So I like to carry a starter that's 50 grams flour and 50 grams water. I've seen a lot of people carry a heavier starter than that with 100 grams flour, 100 grams water, and I've seen people carry less than that, 25 and 25 grams. So just keep in mind that the lower your starter, it may not be enough to produce an actual loaf of bread that you're looking for, and you may need to bulk it up at the end, which is really easy to do. So to eliminate waste, again, I like to keep a smaller starter. So I'm just going to zero out my scale here. And since I'm doing half and half, I'm gonna do 25 grams rye, 25 grams of my bread flour, unbleached. And this can be pretty approximate. If it's not right on the money, that's okay. Because different flours are going to carry different levels of absorption, so it's gonna be slightly different. What we're looking for when we combine flour and water is that it's just a thick paste. So I'm gonna take my water, it's just lukewarm water. If you have a really cold kitchen, or if it's in the middle of winter, I recommend having a little bit warmer of water, not hot, but just a little bit warmer. It's gonna feed off of that warm activity, it likes that. And then alternatively, if it's in the summer or you have a really hot kitchen and you don't want it to pick up as fast, then maybe use a little bit more room temperature, slightly cooler water. Okay, so here we go. I have my equal parts of flour and water, and I'm just gonna give it a mix. So I'm gonna use this spatula to just make sure I get all the edges as clean as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect. And you can use your fingers. Your fingers actually carry just a natural bacteria that is fine, is good for the starter. And then I'm just gonna flatten the top a little bit so that as it rises, it'll rise at an even level, and I'll be able to see how it grows a little bit easier. Perfect. So I just lightly cover this. I don't screw on my lid. I can just let my mason lid rest there, or I'll just keep it loose. I don't want to screw it tight because I want the carbon dioxide to be able to go in and out and let it breathe a little bit. So it's just loosely on there, and then again, masking tape or a rubber band, and I'm gonna line it up. And then I will just let it sit in a warm place out of direct sunlight for 24 hours, and then I'll come back and feed it. You can use, if you want to keep track of the days, masking tape is nice because you can write what day it is. Alternatively, if you're using a rubber band and want to remember, you can keep it in your phone or put a note card on top to mark off the days that you're feeding to help keep track. Feeding it is simple. We're going to follow this same routine once a day, every day, until our starter is ready to use. And again, that can be 6 to 7 days, and it can be up to 14 days, again, depending on so many factors. So to feed it, all you have to do is keep a portion of your starter. I like to keep about 25 grams starter and then feed it with 50 grams water, 50 grams flour. That equates to, usually it's about a tablespoon of starter. So you can transfer it to a new glass if you'd like to keep it clean. If it's getting really crusty and gross on the outside, that naturally builds up over a few days, and that's okay. Or you can just keep feeding it from the same jar and just leave a little bit behind. You can always feed more than the amount of your starter, but just keep in mind you should never feed less than the amount of your starter. So I'm gonna keep 25 grams, and I'm gonna discard the rest. Now, one important thing about when I say discard through this video, it doesn't mean it's trash. There's so many ways to use this extra starter. It's called discard, but really, it's still your starter, it's just an extra amount. So we just don't need it. The reason why we don't need the discard is for a couple of reasons. Because, like I said, I want to keep a lower amount of starter compared to my amount of food. This is now my starter, and I would have to feed it, you know, double the amount of flour and water, at least equal parts, and pretty soon we would be swimming in a kitchen full of starter. So first of all, it's just too much. And you'd be using a ton of flour. We would be putting buckets of flour in this starter with not being able to keep up with baking the amount of bread we need to. So there's several ways to use the discard, okay? You can compost it. The first couple of days, honestly, because it's not a super active discard, I suggest composting it or putting it in the trash. It's just a teeny bit of flour. But after that, after a few days, it's becoming a lot more active. And then I start to use my starter for other things like pancakes, waffles. You can even put in cookies, pizza crust. It's so good. You can, anything that's a dough or a batter, you can put sourdough into easily. And it just makes everything taste great. And it's a great way to use it up. So I will take this out, and I usually like to put it in a separate container, and then if I can't use that discard right away, I'll just pop it in my fridge and let it sit for a couple days until I figure out what I want to bake with it. And again, I'm keeping about 25 grams left in the jar. If you want to be super precise, you could have we could have weighed the original jar, and you can mark it down, know how much your jar weighs, so you can cancel it out on the scale appropriately. Or if you're like me, I just know to leave about a tablespoon in there. Or transferring it to a new jar is super easy as well. Okay, so I have about a tablespoon in there. And then again, to feed it, we're just going to put in our equal parts of water and flour. So I'm going to keep on with the ratio of half rye, half bread flour, and then just kind of a lukewarm water. The only thing about building a starter and the flour I use, I just recommend staying consistent with the kind of flour I'm using. So after I have a fully developed active starter, I can convert it to another kind of starter. If I'm low on one kind of flour, you can easily swap out the flour that you use, but especially when you're getting started, the microbes are getting used to being fed a certain type of bacteria. Every flour carries a slightly different kind of bacteria to it. It's becoming an identity. And so we don't want to confuse its identity. We want to help it grow strong and become predictable. And so we can do that and help it out by staying consistent with the food that we give it. So I'm going to stay consistent with that, but if you are super short, you run out of one thing, flour is easy to switch out. So I'm canceling out my scale, and I'm doing 50 grams water, and then 25 of each flour to create 50 grams. And then just, again, give it a real good mix, make sure all that dry flour is gone. Okay, and there we go. I'm going to loosely cover it, and I can remark it so I can check the growth. And then we'll come back and check on it in 24 hours. So how do we know when our starter is ready to use? Our starter will be ready to use when we see a consistent, predictable manner in how it's rising and falling. So typically your starter is going to rise, and then as it gets hungry and arches over its peak activity, it's going to start falling, which means it's really hungry. It's coming down in activity. So we want to feed it then, and we know if it's consistently doing that and usually going about the same height and about the same time of day, it's pretty predictable, it's really active, it's really steady, you can count on it. Then you can for sure count on it for your bread. Another way to know that your starter is ready, after it's rising and falling and you're feeding it every 12 to 24 hours, depending on what it looks like, you can also do what's called the float test. All you do is you can take a spoon, I like to just dip it in cool water, being careful not to deflate the gases. I just take a spoonful of my starter, place it in the cool water, and if it floats, it means that there's yeast present and that it's releasing enough carbon dioxide that that's what's making it float. That is a good sign that it is ready to use in bread, that it's going to create a great loaf. At that point, you can immediately start baking with it. You can keep feeding it on the counter if you plan to make bread within the next day or two, or you can pop it in the fridge and go to the maintaining schedule. So if you just keep it in your fridge, this one has been sitting in the fridge. That's why it doesn't look super bubbly right now, because it's a pretty dormant starter. So it hasn't been fed in quite a few days, but if I fed it 1 to 2 feedings, it'll perk right back up again. So keep it in the fridge, again, about once a week, once every 2 weeks. You will follow the same feeding schedule that we did in our feeding routine of creating a starter, which is I like to keep about 25 grams of the starter, discard the rest, meaning use it for other things, set it aside for other baking or compost it, and then you'll add equal parts of flour and water. So again, I like to use 50 grams flour, 50 grams water. Then you'll let it you'll lightly cover it again, don't seal it tight, and let it sit on the counter, again in a warm place, out of direct sunlight, and let it rest for a couple of hours so it can start to begin the active process, and then you can go ahead and pop it back in your fridge and say goodbye for the next week or two. All putting it in the fridge does is it slows down the fermentation process, it slows down the activity so that it's still alive, it's still a real starter, but it just means you don't have to feed it as often. If it's sitting on the counter, it's going to get hungry and you're going to have to feed it every 12 to 24 hours. But in the fridge, you can, I typically like to feed it about once a week, but I've gone 2 to 3 weeks and it's still alive and fine. These things are pretty hard to kill. So if you're going to be gone for a couple of weeks, it usually should still be okay. There's also another way that you can do it. You can take a silicone mat and thinly spread starter across the silicone mat. Wait for it to dry completely. Once it's dried completely, break it up into little pieces, place it in some kind of airtight container or jar, and store it at room temperature in a dry place. And then you can go through and reactivate it. Pretty simple, by just adding more water and flour. After a few feedings, it gets back to being a normal starter. So there's more details on that on my website as well if you're interested in drying out a starter for long term, which is great to have as a backup.